The mountain wind howled through Willow Springs like a restless spirit, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of another harsh winter. In the flickering candlelight of the Silver Dollar Saloon, Jake Thompson sat nursing his third whiskey of the evening, watching the amber liquid swirl in his glass like liquid gold. The 28-year-old rancher had the weathered hands of a man who'd spent his life working the land. But tonight those same hands trembled slightly as he contemplated the foreclosure notice folded in his vest pocket. 3 months behind on his mortgage, with winter closing in and his cattle scattered by rustlers, Jake faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. What happened next in that smoky saloon would set in motion a chain of events that would test every principle he'd ever held dear, challenge everything he thought he knew about honor and sacrifice, and ultimately prove that sometimes the most unlikely promises can change not just one life, but an entire community forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake Thompson had never been much of a gambling man, but desperation has a way of changing a person's nature. The Silver Dollar Saloon buzzed with the usual crowd of miners, drifters, and ranch hands seeking warmth and whiskey on this cold October night in 1882. The establishment's wooden floors creaked under heavy boots, and tobacco smoke hung thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake's calloused fingers traced the rim of his glass as he studied the men around the corner table where serious money changed hands nightly. The Thompson Ranch sat on 500 acres of prime grazing land just outside Willow Springs, Colorado territory. Jake's father had built it from nothing, clearing rocks and fighting off claim jumpers to establish what should have been a legacy. But 3 years of drought followed by rustlers and a harsh winter had left Jake struggling to keep the operation afloat. The bank note came due in 2 weeks, and he was 3 months behind on payments. Unless he could raise $800, the ranch would belong to the Colorado Territorial Bank, and Jake would join the ranks of displaced men drifting from town to town looking for work. He'd already sold everything he could spare. His prize stallion, Thunder, had brought $200. His father's gold pocket watch, another $50. The rest of the cattle herd was too small to matter much at market, and winter feed would cost more than the animals were worth. Jake had even considered joining the silver miners working the claims up in Rocky Ridge Pass, but mining was dangerous work that paid little and demanded everything. The poker game in the corner had been running for 3 days straight. Victor Blackwood, the territory's most successful land speculator, sat at the center of it all like a spider in an expensive web. Blackwood wore suits that cost more than most men made in a year, and his manicured fingers moved poker chips with the confidence of someone who'd never known real want. Word around town was that Blackwood had been buying up distressed properties throughout the territory, waiting for the railroad to extend its line through Willow Springs. When that happened, land values would explode overnight. Jake had watched Blackwood foreclose on 3 ranches in the past year alone. The Hendersons had lost their spread in May. The Martinez family saw their homestead auctioned off in July. Each time Blackwood had been there with cash in hand, ready to purchase properties for pennies on the dollar. The man had a gift for appearing helpful while bleeding people dry. Tonight, though, something had changed in the usual dynamic of the game. Blackwood's carefully maintained composure showed cracks of frustration. His pile of chips had dwindled significantly, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air. Across from him sat a man Jake didn't recognize. A tall stranger with intelligent eyes and steady hands who seemed immune to Blackwood's usual intimidation tactics. The stranger called himself Morgan Hayes, claiming to be a cattle buyer from Kansas City. He'd arrived on the afternoon stage with a leather satchel that suggested serious money and a quiet confidence that commanded respect. Unlike the usual run of gamblers who frequented the Silver Dollar, Hayes showed no interest in whiskey or bragging. He simply played cards with mathematical precision, winning steadily without flourish or celebration. Jake nursed his drink and considered his options. He could ride back to his ranch, tend his remaining cattle, and wait for the inevitable foreclosure. Or he could take the $300 hidden in his saddlebags, money meant for winter supplies, and try to multiply it at that poker table. The smart choice was obvious, but smart choices rarely paid off debt and saved family legacies. The saloon's batwing doors swung open, admitting a gust of cold air and Sheriff Tom Mitchell. The lawman scanned the room with practiced eyes, noting faces and potential trouble spots. Mitchell had been keeping the peace in Willow Springs for 8 years, and he understood the delicate balance between maintaining order and allowing men to pursue their own destruction. As long as the gambling stayed honest and the drinking didn't turn violent, he generally left the silver dollar alone. Mitchell's weathered face showed concern as he spotted Jake at the bar. The sheriff had known Jake's father and respected the family's contribution to the community. Seeing Jake in a gambling hall on a night when desperation showed so clearly in his posture worried the lawman. Mitchell approached with casual steps, not wanting to embarrass Jake, but hoping to prevent a mistake. "Evening, Jake," Mitchell said, settling beside him at the bar. "Bit late for you to be in town, isn't it?" Jake managed a weak smile. "Just thinking, Sheriff. Sometimes a man needs whiskey to help him think. Thinking can be dangerous when it's mixed with poker chips and empty pockets." Mitchell observed quietly. "That game over there has been running hot for days." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Seen more than one good man lose everything at that table. The sheriff's words carried weight because everyone knew Mitchell's own story. Before wearing a badge, he'd been a Union cavalry officer who'd lost his family farm to gambling debts after the war. Only a friend's intervention had saved him from complete ruin and led him to law enforcement. Mitchell spoke from experience when he warned about the dangers of trying to solve financial problems with cards and dice. Jake appreciated the concern, but felt the weight of his father's legacy pressing down like a physical burden. The ranch wasn't just property, it was everything his family had built over 2 generations. His father had died defending that land from claim jumpers. His mother was buried in the small cemetery overlooking the south pasture. Walking away without a fight felt like betraying everything that mattered. "Sheriff, you ever face a choice where every option led to regret?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible over the saloon's noise. Mitchell nodded slowly. "More times than I care to remember. But I learned something important about those situations. The choice that feels most desperate usually is. When a man's backed into a corner, his first instinct is often his worst option." Before Jake could respond, a commotion erupted from the poker table. Voices rose in anger, chairs scraped against the floor, and the general buzz of the saloon died to watchful silence. Victor Blackwood had pushed back from the table, his face flushed with alcohol and fury. Morgan Hayes sat perfectly still, his expression neutral as Blackwood pointed an accusing finger across the green felt surface. "No man's luck runs that consistently without help," Blackwood declared loudly enough for the entire saloon to hear. "I've been playing cards for 20 years, and I know when someone's working an angle." Hayes remained calm, his hands visible on the table, his voice level when he responded. "Mr. Blackwood, you're welcome to examine the cards, have the deck changed, or invite anyone here to watch my hands. I understand losing can be frustrating, but accusations require evidence." The challenge hung in the air like gun smoke. Every man in the saloon understood the implications. Calling someone a cheat was fighting words in this territory, especially when significant money was involved. Sheriff Mitchell tensed, ready to intervene if the situation escalated to violence. Blackwood's eyes darted around the room, gauging support and calculating odds. He'd built his reputation on being untouchable, a man with enough money and influence to avoid consequences. But Hayes was an unknown quantity, and the stranger's composed confidence suggested someone comfortable with confrontation. The land speculator forced a laugh that sounded hollow in the silent room. "Perhaps my luck will change with fresh cards and a new perspective on the evening." He signaled the bartender for a new deck, then looked directly at Jake. "Mr. Thompson, you've been watching our game with considerable interest. Care to join us for a hand or two?" Jake felt every eye in the saloon turn toward him. The invitation was both opportunity and trap. Blackwood was clearly trying to recover his losses, and fresh money at the table served his purposes. But it also represented Jake's only realistic chance to raise the money he needed to save his ranch. Sheriff Mitchell touched Jake's arm gently. "Think carefully, son. That man's been bleeding money all night, which makes him twice as dangerous as usual." Jake stood slowly, his decision crystallizing despite the risks. Sometimes a man had to gamble everything to have any chance of keeping what mattered most. He pulled the roll of bills from his jacket, money that represented his last chance at independence. $300 might not seem like much to men like Blackwood, but it was everything Jake had left in the world. "I appreciate the invitation, Mr. Blackwood," Jake said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Count me in for the next hand." The poker table suddenly felt like the center of the universe. Jake took the empty chair between Hayes and a nervous-looking miner named Pete Collins. The leather seat was still warm from its previous occupant, a ranch hand who'd lost 2 months' wages and stumbled out into the night cursing his luck. Jake tried to draw comfort from the fact that Hayes seemed to approve of his decision with a slight nod of encouragement. Blackwood dealt the cards with theatrical flair, his earlier frustration replaced by predatory anticipation. He'd seen desperate men make foolish decisions before, and Jake's situation was common knowledge around Willow Springs. A man facing foreclosure rarely made rational choices at a poker table, which suited Blackwood's purposes perfectly. The first few hands played conservatively as the men took each other's measure. Jake won a small pot with a pair of kings, lost another with unsuccessful bluff, and generally held his own without gaining or losing significant ground. Hayes continued his steady accumulation of chips, while Blackwood grew increasingly aggressive in his betting patterns. As the night wore on, the stakes gradually increased. What had started as nickel and dime poker evolved into serious money-changing hands with each deal. Jake found himself caught between caution and desperation, knowing he needed to win big but terrified of losing everything in pursuit of an impossible dream. The turning point came just after midnight, when Blackwood announced a change in the game's structure. "Gentlemen, I propose we make this evening more interesting. One final hand. Winner takes all the money currently on the table, plus any additional stakes the players wish to add." Hayes studied Blackwood carefully before responding. "That's a significant escalation, Mr. Blackwood. Are you certain you want to risk everything on a single deal?" Blackwood's smile was sharp as a blade. "I'm quite certain, Mr. Hayes. Unless you're not as confident as your recent luck would suggest." Jake's mouth went dry as he calculated the money already in play. Including his own contributions, nearly $2,000 sat in the center of the table. Winner take all meant he could save his ranch and have money left over for winter supplies and spring improvements. It also meant he could lose everything he owned and face winter with empty pockets. The other players folded out of the winner-take-all proposition, leaving just Jake, Hayes, and Blackwood to contest the massive pot. Each man added additional stakes to sweeten the prize. Hayes contributed another $500 from his leather satchel. Blackwood matched it with money from his vest pocket. Jake hesitated, then added the deed to his ranch, knowing it represented his final desperate gamble. Sheriff Mitchell watched from the bar with growing concern. He'd seen men destroy themselves over much smaller stakes, and the amount of money now at risk could devastate any of the 3 players. But gambling was legal in Willow Springs, and men had the right to make their own choices, however foolish those choices might be. The cards were dealt with ceremonial precision. Jake's hand contained 2 pairs, aces and eights, a strong showing that made his heart race with possibility. Hayes showed no emotion as he arranged his cards. Blackwood's breathing became slightly irregular, the only sign of his internal tension. The betting round proceeded with careful deliberation. Each man studied his opponents, looking for tells or signs of weakness. Jake tried to maintain steady breathing while his mind raced through calculations. 2 pairs was a good hand, probably good enough to win against most opposition, but poker required confidence as much as cards. Hayes opened the betting with a substantial raise that forced both other players to commit more money or fold entirely. Blackwood called without hesitation, his earlier nervousness replaced by grim determination. Jake paused for a long moment, feeling the weight of his father's legacy and his own future hanging in the balance. "I call," Jake said quietly, pushing his remaining money forward. The revelation of hands came with electric tension. Jake laid down his 2 pairs with hands that trembled slightly, despite his efforts at control. Blackwood revealed 3 sevens, a powerful hand that made him smile with satisfaction. But Hayes quietly spread 5 cards in sequence, a straight that beat both other hands decisively. The saloon erupted in surprised murmurs and nervous laughter. Jake stared at the cards in disbelief, his ranch deed sitting among the money Hayes was collecting. Everything was gone. 28 years of life had led to this moment of absolute ruin, and Jake couldn't quite process the magnitude of his loss. Blackwood's face cycled through shock, rage, and calculation before settling on cold fury. Convenient how your luck improved exactly when the stakes reached their highest, he said to Hayes. Hayes finished collecting his winnings before responding. Mr. Blackwood, you demanded this winner-take-all arrangement. I merely participated in the game you designed. The land speculator stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This isn't over, he said, though whether he addressed Hayes or Jake wasn't clear. Blackwood stormed out of the saloon, leaving the batwing doors swinging in his wake. Jake sat motionless, still trying to comprehend his new reality. No ranch, no money, no prospects beyond whatever work he could find as a hired hand. The American dream of land ownership and independence had evaporated in a single evening of poor judgment and worse luck. Hayes gathered his winnings methodically, then surprised everyone by sliding Jake's ranch deed back across the table. Mr. Thompson, I believe this belongs to you. Jake stared at the document that represented everything his family had built. I don't understand, you won it fair and square. I won money, not a man's heritage, Hayes replied quietly. Besides, I have a proposition that might interest you. I really am a cattle buyer, and I'm looking for reliable partners in this territory. Your ranch could serve as a valuable base of operations if you're willing to discuss terms. The conversation continued late into the night as Hayes outlined his vision for expanding cattle operations throughout Colorado territory. He offered Jake a partnership arrangement that would save the ranch while providing steady income and growth opportunities. It seemed too good to be true, which made Jake suspicious of hidden costs or obligations. But as they talked, Hayes revealed himself to be a genuinely knowledgeable cattleman with solid business credentials and realistic plans for territorial expansion. His offer represented salvation without charity, a chance for Jake to rebuild his life through hard work rather than dependence on others' generosity. Outside, the wind continued to howl through Willow Springs, but inside the Silver Dollar Saloon, two men shook hands on an agreement that would change both their futures. Jake had entered the poker game facing certain ruin, and found instead an unexpected path forward. Sometimes the darkest moments opened doors to possibilities no one could have imagined. The partnership with Morgan Hayes seemed like divine intervention, but Jake Thompson soon discovered that salvation often comes wrapped in complexities no man can anticipate. 3 weeks after that fateful poker game, Jake found himself riding toward the abandoned Whitmore property with Hayes, surveying potential grazing land for their expanded cattle operation. The October sun cast long shadow across the valley as their horses picked their way along the rocky trail that led to what had once been one of the most prosperous ranches in the territory. Hayes had proven to be exactly what he claimed. A legitimate cattle buyer with ambitious plans and solid financial backing. His proposal was straightforward enough. Jake would provide local knowledge and ranch management while Hayes supplied capital and connections to eastern markets. They would split profits equally after expenses, and Jake would retain ownership of his family ranch while gaining access to additional grazing rights throughout the region. The arrangement should have felt like an answered prayer, but something nagged at Jake's instincts. Hayes was too perfect, too generous, too willing to trust a stranger he'd met at a poker table. In Jake's experience, men with that much money didn't risk it on handshake deals with desperate ranchers unless they knew something others didn't. Still, with winter approaching and his ranch saved from foreclosure, Jake pushed his suspicions aside and focused on making their partnership successful. The Whitmore property sprawled across nearly 800 acres of prime grazing land, complete with natural springs and timber stands that would provide shelter for cattle during harsh weather. Samuel Whitmore had built the ranch over 15 years, transforming raw wilderness into a model operation that supplied beef to mining camps throughout the Rocky Ridge Pass region. But Whitmore had made the fatal mistake of extending too much credit to miners who paid with promises rather than cash. When the silver played out in several key claims, those promises became worthless paper, and Whitmore lost everything to creditors who cared nothing for the sweat and dreams invested in every fence post and barn beam. Hayes dismounted near the abandoned ranch house and walked the property with the practiced eye of someone who understood land values. He pointed out natural advantages and potential improvements while Jake mentally calculated the cost of bringing the operation back to productive status. The buildings needed work, the fences required extensive repair, and years of neglect had allowed brush to reclaim what had once been cleared pasture. This property will be available at the next tax auction, Hayes said, consulting a folded document from his jacket pocket. Territories asking $300 for back taxes, which represents perhaps 10% of the land's actual value. Jake whistled low. The Whitmore Ranch was worth at least $3,000, probably more when the railroad finally extended through Willow Springs. Buying it for tax debt would be like stealing, except everything was perfectly legal. The territory needed revenue more than it needed fairness, and someone would claim the property whether Jake and Hayes acted or not. "You've done considerable research," Jake observed, studying his partner's prepared documentation. "Almost like you knew this opportunity would be available before you arrived in Willow Springs." Hayes smiled without defensiveness. "Successful business requires preparation, Mr. Thompson. I've been tracking distressed properties throughout Colorado Territory for months, waiting for the right moment and the right local partner. Your situation presented exactly what I needed." The admission should have reassured Jake, but instead it deepened his unease. Hayes spoke about their partnership like a chess move he'd planned several steps in advance. Jake was a useful piece in some larger game he didn't fully understand. Still, useful pieces often benefited from the games they enabled, and Jake's alternatives remained extremely limited. They spent the afternoon exploring the property and discussing renovation plans. Hayes estimated it would take 6 months and $1,500 to restore the ranch to full productivity. With proper management, the combined properties could support 3 times as many cattle as Jake currently ran, generating enough profit to repay the investment within 2 years. The numbers made sense, and the opportunity was undeniably attractive. As they prepared to leave, Hayes mentioned a detail that changed everything. "There's one additional matter we should discuss, Mr. Thompson. The property comes with certain obligations." Jake's hand tightened on his horse's reins. In his experience, obligations mentioned as afterthoughts usually proved more significant than anything discussed openly. "What kind of obligations?" Samuel Whitmore's daughter remained on the property after the foreclosure. "She has no legal rights to the land, but she's been caring for her ailing father in the old ranch house. Whoever purchases the property will need to address her situation." The casual tone didn't match the complexity of the issue Hayes had just revealed. A young woman living alone on abandoned property created legal and social complications that could affect any future development plans. Jake had assumed the Whitmore family had relocated after losing their ranch, but apparently one member had refused to abandon her family's legacy. "Where exactly does she live?" Jake asked, scanning the seemingly empty buildings. Hayes pointed toward a small cabin nestled among cottonwood trees near the property's eastern boundary. Smoke rose from its chimney, and clothes hung on a line stretched between 2 trees. Someone was definitely living there, maintaining the basic routines of domestic life, despite having no legal claim to the land. Emma Whitmore, Hayes continued. 24 years old, unmarried, caring for her father who suffered a stroke during the foreclosure proceedings. She's been supporting them both by taking in laundry and sewing work from town. But it's hardly a sustainable situation. Jake studied the distant cabin and felt his conscience stirring. The Whitmore family had lost everything through no fault of their own, victims of economic forces beyond any individual's control. Now the daughter was trapped in an impossible situation, caring for an invalid father while living on land that legally belonged to whoever paid the back taxes. What happens to them when the property's sold? Hayes shrugged with apparent indifference. Not our concern, really. The new owner could allow them to remain as tenants, or they could be required to relocate. Most purchasers prefer a clean acquisition without complications from previous occupants. The cold practicality of Hayes's response revealed something unsettling about his character. This was a man who viewed human complications as problems to be solved rather than people deserving consideration. Jake began to understand why Hayes had needed a local partner. Someone with regional ties and community standing could handle the messy human elements that might interfere with pure business calculations. They rode back toward Willow Springs in thoughtful silence as shadows lengthened across the valley. Jake's mind wrestled with competing obligations and opportunities. The partnership with Hayes represented his best chance for financial security and expanded prospects. But it also required him to participate in decisions that might harm innocent people who'd already suffered enough misfortune. The moral weight of the situation pressed down like a physical burden. Jake's father had built the family ranch through honest work and fair dealing. He'd never taken advantage of others' misfortune or prioritized profit over principle. Now Jake faced choices that would define what kind of man he intended to be, and whether he could live with the consequences of his decisions. That evening, Jake sat on his cabin porch watching stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. The partnership documents Hayes had prepared lay on the table beside him, requiring only his signature to formalize their agreement. Everything was spelled out clearly: profit sharing, management responsibilities, expansion timelines, and investment schedules. Hayes had even included a clause protecting Jake's original ranch from any future business liabilities. But the documents said nothing about Emma Whitmore or her invalid father. Their fate would be determined by handshake agreements and verbal understandings that carried no legal weight. Jake could influence what happened to them, but only if he maintained Hayes's respect and partnership. Cross the cattle buyer on matters he considered irrelevant to business, and Jake might find himself without a partner and back where he started. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Jake's ranch. Sheriff Tom Mitchell rode up the valley trail leading a spare horse and wearing the grim expression that usually meant serious trouble. Jake met him at the barn, noting the lawman's careful survey of the property and obvious interest in any signs of recent activity. "Morning," Jake Mitchell said, dismounting with the careful movements of a man who'd spent too many hours in the saddle. "Need to ask you some questions about your new business partner." Jake's stomach tightened. He'd been expecting this conversation since Hayes first appeared in Willow Springs. Men with that much money and those kinds of opportunities rarely arrived in small territorial towns without attracting official attention. "What kind of questions?" Mitchell pulled a telegram from his vest pocket and consulted it before responding. "Got word from the territorial marshal's office yesterday. They're tracking a confidence man who's been operating throughout Colorado and Kansas, targeting ranchers facing financial difficulties. Description matches your Mr. Hayes pretty closely." The accusation hung in the air like a death sentence. Jake had risked everything on his partnership with Hayes, and now the sheriff was suggesting his savior might be a criminal who specialized in exploiting desperate men. If true, it meant Jake had walked directly into a trap designed specifically for someone in his circumstances. "What kind of confidence scheme?" Jake asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Classic setup," Mitchell explained. "Fellow approaches struggling ranchers with partnership offers and investment opportunities. Gets them to sign over property rights or take on debt obligations. Then disappears with whatever he can steal. Leaves his victims worse off than when he found them."
Jake's mind raced through his recent interactions with Hayes, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. The cattle buyer's knowledge had seemed genuine, his documentation convincing, his financial resources real. But confidence men succeeded by appearing credible until the moment they revealed their true nature. "Sheriff, I've seen Hayes's money. He paid for his hotel room in advance, bought supplies with cash, covered all his expenses without borrowing or making promises. If he's running a confidence game, it's an expensive one." Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. Best confidence men invest their own money up front to establish credibility. Makes the eventual payoff much larger when victims trust them with significant assets. He paused, studying Jake's worried expression. "I'm not saying Hayes is
Definitely our man, but you'd be wise to proceed carefully until we know more." The sheriff's warning left Jake in an impossible position. He needed Hayes' partnership to save his ranch and build a sustainable future. But if Hayes was a criminal, continuing their association could destroy everything Jake owned and possibly land him in legal trouble as an unwitting accomplice. Yet backing out of their agreement without proof of wrongdoing would mark Jake as unreliable and eliminate his best hope for financial recovery. Mitchell seemed to understand Jake's dilemma. "Tell you what," the sheriff said. "I'll wire for more information about Hayes's background and recent activities. Meanwhile, you keep your eyes open and don't sign anything that puts your property at risk. If he's legitimate, a few days' delay won't matter. If he's not, caution might save your life." After Mitchell rode away, Jake found himself studying the partnership documents with new suspicion. The terms that had seemed generous now appeared potentially manipulative. Hayes had structured the agreement to require Jake's local knowledge and community connections while limiting his own legal exposure. If the cattle buyer disappeared suddenly, Jake would be left holding responsibility for debts and obligations he couldn't meet. The uncertainty was maddening. Jake needed to make decisions about winter preparations, cattle management, and property improvements. But every choice depended on whether his partnership was genuine or fraudulent. Hayes expected answers about the Whitmore property purchase within days. But committing to that investment now seemed incredibly risky. 2 days later, Hayes appeared at Jake's ranch with news that forced an immediate decision. "Thompson, there's been a development regarding the Whitmore property. Another buyer has expressed interest in the tax auction, which means we need to act quickly if we want to secure the land." Jake set down the fence post he'd been repairing and gave Hayes his full attention. "What kind of buyer?" "Victor Blackwood." Hayes's expression showed distaste for the land speculator. "Apparently our poker game inspired him to research distressed properties more aggressively. He's planning to bid on several tax auction properties, including the Whitmore Ranch." The news struck Jake like a physical blow. Blackwood's involvement changed everything about the situation. The land speculator had no interest in ranching or cattle operations. He would purchase properties purely for their investment potential, holding them until railroad development made resale profitable. If Blackwood acquired the Whitmore Ranch, he would evict Emma and her father immediately and leave the property empty until market conditions suited his purposes. "How much time do we have?" Jake asked. "The auction is scheduled for next Tuesday. We need to submit our bid and payment by Monday afternoon." Hayes consulted his pocket watch. "That gives us exactly 4 days to finalize our decision." Jake's mind raced through implications and possibilities. 4 days to determine whether Hayes was legitimate or criminal. 4 days to decide whether saving the Whitmore family justified risking his own financial future. 4 days to choose between safe caution and potentially catastrophic action. "There's something else," Hayes continued. "I took the liberty of visiting the Whitmore cabin yesterday to assess the situation personally. Miss Whitmore's circumstances are even more difficult than I initially understood." Hayes described a scene that broke Jake's heart. Emma Whitmore was indeed caring for her stroke-paralyzed father in a one-room cabin with minimal resources and no prospects for improvement. She'd been selling family possessions to buy medicine and food, but valuable items were running out. Winter would bring expenses she couldn't possibly meet, and her father's condition required constant attention that prevented her from seeking more substantial employment. "She's a remarkable young woman," Hayes admitted with what seemed like genuine admiration. "Educated, capable, completely devoted to her father's care. Under different circumstances, she could probably manage the ranch operation as well as any man." The comment sparked an idea in Jake's mind. If Emma Whitmore had ranching knowledge and management skills, she could potentially contribute to their partnership rather than simply representing an obligation to be managed. Many successful ranches throughout the territory were run by women who'd inherited or married into the business. Gender mattered less than competence when survival was at stake. "Did you discuss our plans with her?" Jake asked. Hayes shook his head. "I thought it best to wait until we'd finalized our decision. No point in raising hopes or fears prematurely." Jake appreciated the consideration, but he realized he needed to understand Emma's situation personally before committing to any course of action. Her welfare had become central to his decision-making process, and he couldn't evaluate options properly without knowing what she needed and wanted. "I'd like to visit the Whitmore cabin myself," Jake announced. "If we're going to make decisions that affect her future, she deserves to have some input in the process." Hayes looked surprised by the suggestion. "Mr. Thompson, with respect, business decisions shouldn't be influenced by emotional considerations. We're discussing significant financial investments, not charity work." The response revealed more of Hayes's character than Jake found comfortable. A man who dismissed human welfare as emotional consideration probably wouldn't hesitate to break promises when profit was involved. Still, Jake needed to proceed carefully until he knew more about Hayes's true nature and intentions. "You're right about the business aspects," Jake said diplomatically. "But local knowledge includes understanding the people involved. Miss Whitmore might have information about the property that could affect our investment decision." Hayes accepted the reasoning with apparent satisfaction. They agreed to visit the Whitmore cabin the following morning, giving Jake a chance to assess both Emma's situation and Hayes's reaction to her circumstances. The meeting would either confirm Hayes's legitimacy or reveal problems that would force Jake to reconsider their entire partnership. That night, Jake lay awake staring at his cabin ceiling and wrestling with decisions that would define his future. Every choice carried serious risks and uncertain benefits. Trust Hayes and risk everything on a partnership that might be fraudulent. Refuse Hayes and lose his best chance for financial recovery. Involve himself in Emma Whitmore's problems and complicate an already difficult situation. Ignore her plight and violate every principle his father had taught him about helping neighbors in need. The wind howled through the valley like a living thing, carrying with it the scent of approaching winter and the promise of choices that couldn't be delayed much longer. By week's end, Jake would know whether he'd found salvation or walked deeper into trouble than he'd ever imagined possible. Morning brought crystalline air and the kind of brilliant sunshine that made Colorado Territory seem like the most beautiful place on earth. Jake saddled his horse and met Hayes at the designated meeting point, a grove of aspen trees halfway between their respective accommodations. The cattle buyer appeared punctual and well prepared, with saddlebags containing documents and what appeared to be survey equipment. They rode toward the Whitmore property in companionable silence, each man lost in his own thoughts about the upcoming conversation. Jake found himself studying Hayes for signs of deception or hidden agenda, but his partner maintained the same composed demeanor that had characterized all their previous interactions. If Hayes was running a confident scheme, he was remarkably skilled at concealing his true nature. The Whitmore cabin came into view as they crested a small ridge overlooking the eastern portion of the property. Smoke rose from the chimney, and laundry fluttered on lines strung between cottonwood trees. A small vegetable garden showed signs of careful tending despite the approaching winter, and chickens pecked around a well-maintained coop. Someone was clearly working hard to maintain normal domestic life under extremely difficult circumstances. Emma Whitmore emerged from the cabin as they approached, alerted by the sound of horses. Jake's first impression was of quiet dignity and unmistakable intelligence. She wore a simple dress that had been mended several times but remained clean and presentable. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her green eyes showed wariness but no fear as she assessed the two strangers riding toward her home. "Miss Whitmore," Hayes called out as they dismounted. "I'm Morgan Hayes, and this is my partner Jake Thompson. We spoke briefly yesterday about your situation." Emma nodded politely but kept her distance. "Mr. Hayes, I remember our conversation." Her voice carried the educated accent of someone who'd received formal schooling, unusual for women in this remote territory. "How can I help you gentlemen?" Jake stepped forward, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "Miss Whitmore, we're considering purchasing this property at the tax auction. Mr. Hayes thought we should discuss how that might affect your circumstances. For a moment, Emma's composure cracked, revealing the fear and uncertainty she'd been hiding behind her dignified facade. She recovered quickly, but not before Jake glimpsed the desperate situation she faced. Losing access to the cabin would leave her homeless with an invalid father and winter approaching fast. "I see," she said quietly. "And you're here to inform me that I'll need to find alternative accommodations." The resignation in her voice cut Jake like a blade. This was a woman who'd already accepted the worst possible outcome and was simply waiting for official confirmation. Her dignity in the face of inevitable displacement showed remarkable strength of character. "Actually," Jake said, improvising rapidly, "we're here to discuss whether you might be interested in staying on as part of our operation." Hayes shot him a sharp look, clearly surprised by the deviation from their planned approach. But Jake pressed forward, following instincts that told him Emma Whitmore represented an opportunity rather than an obligation. "We're planning to restore this ranch to full productivity," Jake continued. "That will require someone with local knowledge and management skills. If you're interested and qualified, we'd like to discuss employment possibilities." Emma's eyes widened with surprise and hope. "You're offering me work?" "We're offering to discuss it," Jake clarified, aware that Hayes was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the conversation's direction. "But first, we'd need to understand your experience and capabilities." What followed was a remarkable revelation of competence and knowledge. Emma had essentially managed the Whitmore Ranch for the final 3 years before the foreclosure, handling everything from cattle breeding records to financial planning. Her father's stroke had occurred after losing the property, not before, which meant she'd been forced to watch helplessly as creditors dismantled everything she'd helped build. She knew every water source, grazing area, and seasonal pattern on the 800 acres. She could identify cattle diseases, calculate feed requirements, and plan breeding schedules that maximized productivity. Most remarkably, she'd maintained detailed records of everything, preserving information that would be invaluable for anyone trying to restore the operation. "Miss Whitmore," Hayes interjected during a pause in her presentation, "your knowledge is certainly impressive. But ranch management requires physical demands that might prove challenging for someone in your circumstances." Jake bristled at the dismissive tone, but Emma responded with quiet confidence. "Mr. Hayes, I've been managing physical demands quite successfully. Caring for my father, maintaining our living situation, and supporting us both financially requires considerable physical capability." To prove her point, Emma led them to the barn where she'd been storing equipment and supplies salvaged from the main ranch before creditors could claim them. Her organizational system was methodical and efficient, with everything cataloged and maintained despite being stored in less than ideal conditions. "My father always said that good ranch management was 10% physical work and 90% planning and attention to detail," Emma explained as she showed them breeding records dating back 5 years. "The physical work can be hired when you have the knowledge to direct it properly." Jake found himself increasingly impressed by Emma's capabilities and increasingly uncomfortable with Hayes's obvious skepticism. The cattle buyer seemed determined to find reasons why employing Emma would be problematic rather than recognizing the advantages her knowledge could provide. "There's also the matter of propriety," Hayes said finally. "A single woman working closely with men in an isolated ranch setting would create social complications that could affect our business relationships." The objection revealed Hayes's conventional attitudes about women's roles, but it also highlighted a real challenge. Territorial society maintained strict expectations about appropriate behavior between unmarried men and women. Violating those expectations could indeed complicate business relationships and social standing. Emma's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "I understand your concerns, gentlemen. Perhaps I should simply accept that my situation is hopeless and stop wasting your time." She turned to walk away, but Jake called after her. "Miss Whitmore, wait. There might be solutions we haven't considered yet." Emma paused but didn't turn around. Her shoulders were rigid with wounded pride and suppressed emotion. Jake realized he'd reached a moment that would define not just their business relationship but his own character and principles. "What kind of solutions?" Hayes asked, his tone suggesting limited patience for complications. Jake took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. Marriage. The word hung in the air like a gunshot, reverberating through the autumn stillness with implications none of them had anticipated. Emma Whitmore spun around, her green eyes wide with shock and something that might have been hope or horror. Morgan Hayes's carefully composed expression cracked, revealing genuine surprise at Jake's unexpected proposal. Even Jake himself seemed startled by what he'd just suggested, as if the words had escaped without consulting his rational mind. Marriage, Jake repeated, his voice steadier the second time as his mind caught up with his instincts. A business arrangement that would solve the propriety concerns while allowing Miss Whitmore to contribute her knowledge to our ranch operation. Emma's face cycled through emotions too quickly to catalog. Surprise gave way to calculation, then to something resembling cautious interest before settling into wary assessment. She was clearly trying to determine whether Jake's proposal represented genuine opportunity or simply a different form of exploitation disguised as respectability. Hayes recovered his composure with visible effort. Mr. Thompson, that's a rather dramatic solution to what amounts to an employment question. Perhaps we should discuss this privately before making such significant suggestions. The cattle buyer's discomfort was obvious and telling. A legitimate business partner might question the wisdom of Jake's proposal, but he wouldn't react with the kind of alarm Hayes was displaying. The suggestion of marriage threatened something about Hayes's plans, though Jake couldn't yet determine exactly what. Hayes makes a valid point, Emma said quietly. This is hardly a decision to be made impulsively, and I'm not certain I understand what you're proposing, Mr. Thompson. Jake realized he needed to clarify his intentions before the situation spiraled beyond recovery. Miss Whitmore, I'm suggesting a marriage of convenience. A legal arrangement that would provide you with security and social respectability while giving our ranch operation access to your knowledge and management skills. It would be a business partnership formalized through marriage rather than a romantic relationship. The explanation seemed to reassure Emma while increasing Hayes's obvious agitation. She studied Jake's face carefully, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. What she saw there apparently satisfied her initial concerns, because her posture relaxed slightly and her expression grew thoughtful. Such arrangements aren't uncommon in the territories, she acknowledged. Many successful partnerships have been built on mutual benefit rather than romantic attachment. She paused, considering implications and possibilities. But it would still represent a significant commitment for both parties involved. Hayes stepped forward with barely concealed urgency. Mr. Thompson, surely you realize this complicates our business arrangement considerably. We agreed to a cattle operation partnership, not a matrimonial adventure that could affect every aspect of our venture. The objection revealed more about Hayes's true concerns than he probably intended. A legitimate business partner would focus on practical considerations like Emma's qualifications and the ranch's operational needs. Hayes seemed more worried about losing control over Jake's decision-making process, which suggested motives beyond simple cattle trading. Jake's suspicions about Hayes crystallized into something approaching certainty. Sheriff Mitchell's warnings about confidence men suddenly seemed prophetic rather than precautionary. Hayes needed Jake compliant and isolated, dependent on their partnership without alternative support systems. A wife with knowledge and capabilities would complicate any scheme that required Jake's complete vulnerability. Our partnership can accommodate marriage, Jake said firmly. In fact, Miss Whitmore's expertise might make our operation more profitable than either of us originally projected. Emma looked between the two men, clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand. Gentlemen, perhaps I should leave you to discuss your business arrangements. This conversation has taken directions I didn't anticipate, and I need time to consider everything that's been suggested. She started toward the cabin, but Hayes called after her with apparent desperation. Miss Whitmore, before you make any decisions, you should understand that Mr. Thompson's proposal might not be as advantageous as it initially appears. Emma stopped and turned back, her expression questioning. Jake felt tension coiling in his stomach like a snake preparing to strike. Hayes was about to reveal something that would change the entire dynamic of their conversation. What do you mean? Emma asked.
Hayes glanced at Jake with what might have been apology or calculation. Mr. Thompson's ranch is heavily mortgaged and facing foreclosure. His financial situation is desperate enough that he recently gambled everything he owned at a poker table. Marrying him might provide short-term security, but it could also involve you in financial obligations that exceed your current difficulties. The revelation hit Emma like a physical blow. Her face went pale as she absorbed the implications of what Hayes had just disclosed. Jake's generous offer suddenly appeared to be the desperate gamble of a man with nothing to lose, potentially dragging her into worse circumstances than she already faced. Jake felt anger rising in his chest, not at the revelation itself but at Hayes's manipulation of the information. Everything the cattle buyer had said was technically true, but the way he'd presented it twisted reality to serve his own purposes. Jake's financial recovery through their partnership became irrelevant when Hayes chose to focus only on past desperation. "Mr. Hayes is correct about my recent difficulties," Jake said, choosing honesty over damage control, but he's omitting relevant information about our partnership and its potential for resolving those financial problems. Emma's intelligent eyes moved between the two men as she tried to parse truth from manipulation. The situation had become so complex that simple explanations seemed inadequate for the layers of motive and possibility involved. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "you gentlemen should explain exactly what your partnership entails and how my potential involvement would affect both your business plans and my personal circumstances." What followed was the most honest conversation Jake had experienced since Hayes arrived in Willow Springs. Forced to speak plainly in front of Emma, both men revealed more about their intentions and concerns than either had previously shared. Hayes described his cattle buying operation and expansion plans with mathematical precision, while Jake explained his financial recovery strategy and long-term goals for the combined ranch properties. Emma listened with the focused attention of someone whose future depended on understanding every nuance of what she was hearing. She asked penetrating questions about profit projections, operational timelines, and legal arrangements that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of business principles. "Hayes," she said during a pause in their explanations, "your expansion plans require significant local knowledge and community relationships. Mr. Thompson provides those elements, but what happens if your partnership dissolves for any reason?" The question struck at the heart of Jake's own concerns about their arrangement. Hayes had structured their agreement to minimize his own risks while maximizing Jake's exposure to potential losses. If Hayes disappeared or decided to terminate their partnership, Jake would be left with obligations he couldn't meet and debts he couldn't repay. Hayes's answer was smooth but evasive. "Business partnerships always involve some degree of mutual dependence, Miss Whitmore. Both Mr. Thompson and I have incentives to ensure our arrangement succeeds." Emma wasn't satisfied with the non-answer. "But your incentives aren't equally balanced, are they? Mr. Thompson risks his family property and his future in this territory. Your risks appear more limited and recoverable." The observation was astute enough to make Hayes visibly uncomfortable. Emma had identified the fundamental imbalance in their partnership within minutes of hearing its details. Her business acumen was clearly more sophisticated than either man had anticipated. Jake found himself reassessing both his partnership with Hayes and his impulsive marriage proposal. Emma's analytical approach to their situation revealed problems he'd been too desperate or distracted to recognize. Her involvement in their business discussions was already proving valuable, regardless of any matrimonial considerations. "Miss Whitmore raises valid concerns," Jake admitted. "Perhaps we should restructure our partnership to address those imbalances before moving forward with any expansion plans." Hayes's alarm was now obvious enough that even Emma noticed his reaction. "Mr. Thompson, our current agreement has been carefully crafted to ensure mutual benefit. Changing terms at this stage could complicate legal and financial arrangements we've already initiated." The response confirmed Jake's growing suspicions about Hayes's true nature. A legitimate partner would welcome improvements that strengthened their business relationship. Hayes seemed determined to prevent any changes that might reduce his advantages or increase Jake's security. Emma's expression had grown increasingly thoughtful as she observed the dynamics between the two men. When she spoke again, her words carried the weight of careful consideration and firm decision. "Mr. Thompson, I believe I understand your situation better now. If you're serious about your marriage proposal, I'd like to discuss it privately, without business considerations complicating our conversation." Hayes started to object, but Emma cut him off with polite firmness. "Hayes, surely you understand that matrimonial decisions require personal discussion between the parties involved. Business partnerships and marriage arrangements, even marriages of convenience, operate according to different principles." Faced with social conventions he couldn't reasonably challenge, Hayes had no choice but to accept Emma's request for privacy. "Of course, Miss Whitmore. I'll wait by the horses while you and Mr. Thompson discuss personal matters." As Hayes walked away, clearly frustrated by his exclusion from their conversation, Emma gestured for Jake to follow her to a fallen log that served as a natural bench overlooking the valley. The autumn landscape spread before them in brilliant colors, peaceful and beautiful despite the human complications being played out against its backdrop. "Thompson," Emma began once they were seated and out of Hayes's hearing, "I need to understand your motivations before I can consider your proposal seriously. Are you offering marriage because you believe it would benefit our business interests, or because you're trying to rescue me from my current circumstances?" The directness of her question forced Jake to examine his own motives more honestly than he'd done since making his impulsive suggestion. Was he acting from business calculation, charitable impulse, or something more complex that he hadn't yet recognized? "Both," he said finally. "And neither, if that makes sense. Miss Whitmore, you clearly have knowledge and skills that would benefit any ranch operation. But you also deserve better than the circumstances you're facing through no fault of your own. If marriage could address both concerns, it seems like a solution worth considering." Emma studied his face with the same careful attention she'd given to their business discussion. "And what would you expect from such a marriage? You mentioned a business arrangement, but marriage involves personal obligations and expectations that can't be entirely separated from business considerations." Jake realized he hadn't thought through the practical implications of his proposal beyond solving immediate problems. Marriage, even a marriage of convenience, would create intimate daily contact and shared responsibilities that went far beyond business partnerships. Emma would become part of his household, his social circle, and his personal life in ways that could complicate or enrich everything he'd planned for his future. "I expect respect, honesty, and mutual support," he said slowly, working through his thoughts as he spoke. "I expect shared decision-making about matters that affect both our interests. I expect loyalty and commitment to making our arrangement succeed." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "I don't expect romantic love, but I hope for friendship and partnership in every sense of those words." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Those are reasonable expectations. But there's something you should understand about my situation before you finalize such a generous offer." Her tone carried warning that made Jake's stomach tighten with apprehension. He'd assumed he understood Emma's circumstances based on Hayes's description and their conversation, but apparently important information remained hidden. "My father's stroke wasn't caused by the stress of losing our ranch," Emma said quietly. "He was shot during a confrontation with men who came to take possession of our property. The stroke happened later, as a complication of his injuries." The revelation stunned Jake into silence. He'd imagined financial ruin and forced relocation, difficult circumstances but essentially civil proceedings. Emma was describing something much darker, involving violence and ongoing danger that could affect anyone associated with her family. "Who shot him?" Jake asked. "We were never able to prove it, but we believe Victor Blackwood hired men to intimidate us into leaving without legal complications. When my father refused to be bullied, they escalated to violence." Emma's voice carried controlled anger and pain.
"Any witnesses to his previous actions?" Emma's smile was bitter and knowing. "Mr. Thompson, I'm fully aware of my danger. That's one reason I haven't been able to leave this property despite having no legal rights to remain. Moving my father in his condition would be extremely difficult, and Blackwood has made it clear that he considers our family a continuing threat to his interests. The complexity of Emma's situation was staggering. She wasn't just a woman facing homelessness and financial hardship, she was a witness to attempted murder, caring for a victim of that violence, while living under the ongoing threat of a powerful man who had strong reasons to want her silenced permanently. Jake's marriage proposal suddenly seemed naively inadequate for the realities Emma faced. Marrying him might provide legal protection and social respectability, but it would also make Jake a target for Blackwood's violence. Their partnership would represent a direct challenge to the land speculator's interests and potentially trigger escalation he wasn't prepared to handle. "Emma," he said, using her first name without thinking, "you should have told me about the danger before I made my proposal. This changes everything about what marriage to me would mean." She turned to study his profile as he stared across the valley toward Willow Springs. "Does it change your offer?" The question forced Jake to confront his own character and commitment. Was he the kind of man who offered help only when it was convenient and safe? Or was he willing to accept genuine risk in service of principles he claimed to value? His father had built their ranch by standing up to claim jumpers and cattle thieves who threatened honest settlers throughout the territory. Thomas Thompson had never backed down from confrontation when principles were at stake, even when discretion might have been the wiser choice. Jake had inherited more than land from his father. He'd inherited the responsibility to live up to the example he'd been given. "No," Jake said firmly. "It doesn't change my offer. If anything, it makes it more important." Emma's expression softened with something that might have been relief or admiration. "Mr. Thompson, you should understand that accepting my situation means accepting conflict with a dangerous man who has significant resources and no apparent conscience. Blackwood won't hesitate to use violence against anyone who interferes with his plans." Jake stood and extended his hand to help Emma up from the log. "Miss Whitmore, I've been thinking about this situation all wrong. I offered marriage as a solution to business and social problems, but what you really need is an ally who's willing to stand with you against Blackwood's threats." Emma accepted his assistance and rose gracefully, her hand lingering in his for a moment longer than strictly necessary. "And you're willing to be that ally?" "I'm willing to be your husband," Jake said simply. "Everything else follows from that commitment." They walked back toward the cabin where Hayes waited with obvious impatience beside their horses. Jake's mind was already working through the implications of his decision and the practical steps that would be required to protect Emma and challenge Blackwood's influence. Marriage was just the beginning of what would certainly be a complex and dangerous confrontation. Hayes looked up as they approached, clearly trying to read the results of their private conversation in their expressions and body language. "I trust you've reached some understanding about the various complications we've been discussing." "We have," Jake said. "Miss Whitmore has agreed to marry me, which will resolve the employment and propriety concerns you raised. We'll proceed with the tax auction bid as planned, but with some modifications to our original partnership agreement." The news hit Hayes like a physical blow. His carefully maintained composure cracked completely, revealing anger and calculation that confirmed Jake's worst suspicions about his partner's true nature. "Mr. Thompson, this represents a significant change in our arrangements. I'm not certain our partnership can accommodate such dramatic alterations to the original plan." Jake met Hayes's glare with steady resolve. "Mr. Hayes, our partnership was always going to evolve as circumstances required. If you're not comfortable with those changes, we can certainly discuss alternative arrangements." The implicit threat was clear. Jake was no longer the desperate man who'd gratefully accepted any partnership offered. Emma's presence and support had given him options and confidence that changed the entire dynamic of his relationship with Hayes. Emma stepped forward with diplomatic grace. "Mr. Hayes, surely an experienced businessman like yourself understands that successful operations require flexibility and adaptation. Mr. Thompson and I can provide exactly the local knowledge and community connections your expansion plans require." Her intervention gave Hayes an opportunity to retreat gracefully from his confrontational stance. But his response revealed how thoroughly Jake's independence threatened his schemes. "Miss Whitmore, with all due respect, I'm not certain you understand the complexities of the cattle business or the financial commitments involved in territorial expansion." The condescending dismissal was a mistake that revealed Hayes's true character more clearly than anything he'd said previously. Emma's eyes flashed with controlled anger at being dismissed as irrelevant to business discussions she'd been dominating through superior knowledge and insight. "Mr. Hayes," she said with dangerous calm, "I've been managing cattle operations since I was 16 years old. My family's ranch was profitable for over a decade under my operational supervision. Perhaps you'd like to explain which complexities you believe exceed my understanding." Hayes realized his error too late to recover gracefully. He'd underestimated Emma's capabilities and overplayed his own authority in a situation where he had little leverage. Jake watched with growing satisfaction as his partner's carefully constructed facade crumbled under pressure. "Of course, Miss Whitmore, I didn't mean to suggest you lacked relevant experience. I was simply concerned about the timeline pressures we're facing with the tax auction approaching." The weak apology fooled no one, but it provided an opportunity to move past the confrontation toward practical planning. Jake seized the moment to establish new terms for their continued association. "Mr. Hayes, I think we need to clarify the structure of our partnership before proceeding further. Emma will be my wife and an equal partner in our ranch operations. Any agreements we make must reflect that reality." Hayes's expression cycled through calculation, frustration, and something approaching desperation before settling on forced acceptance. "Very well, Mr. Thompson. Perhaps we should schedule a more formal meeting to discuss revised partnership terms and operational procedures." Jake agreed to meet Hayes in town the following day to negotiate their new arrangement. As the cattle buyer rode away, clearly shaken by developments he hadn't anticipated, Jake felt a mixture of relief and apprehension about what he'd committed himself to accomplish. Emma stood beside him, watching Hayes disappear over the ridge toward Willow Springs. "Mr. Thompson, I believe you've just made a very dangerous enemy. That man is not what he pretends to be." Jake nodded grimly. "I've been reaching the same conclusion. Sheriff Mitchell warned me that Hayes might be running some kind of confidence scheme. After today's conversation, I'm inclined to believe those warnings." Emma turned to face him directly, her expression serious and determined. "Jake, if we're going to be married, even as a business arrangement, we need to be completely honest with each other about the risks we're facing. Blackwood is dangerous, but he's also a known quantity. Hayes represents an unknown threat that could be even more destructive." The use of his first name felt natural and appropriate, marking a transition from formal business discussion to personal partnership. Jake realized they'd crossed an invisible line during their conversation, moving from strangers considering a practical arrangement to allies preparing for shared challenges. "Emma, before we go any further with marriage plans, there's something I need to tell you about my situation with Hayes and the sheriff's investigation." He explained everything Mitchell had shared about confidence men operating throughout the territory. Hayes's suspicious arrival and generous offers, and his own growing concerns about hidden motives behind their partnership. Emma listened with the same focused attention she'd given to their earlier business discussions, asking clarifying questions and identifying implications. Jake hadn't fully considered. "So we're facing threats from both Blackwood and Hayes," she summarized when he'd finished. "One man who uses violence to get what he wants, and another who uses deception and manipulation." Jake nodded soberly. "Marrying me means you'll be caught between both dangers. Are you certain you want to accept those risks?" Emma's smile was fierce and determined. "Jake, I've been living under Blackwood's threats for months while caring for my father and trying to survive on property I have no legal right to occupy. Facing those same dangers with a partner and ally sounds like an improvement over facing them alone." They spent the rest of the afternoon making practical plans for their marriage and the challenges it would bring. The ceremony would need to happen quickly, before the tax auction, to establish their legal partnership and property rights. They would need to prepare defenses against both Hayes's schemes and Blackwood's violence. Most importantly, they would need to build trust and understanding between themselves strong enough to sustain them through whatever trials lay ahead. As the sun set over the valley, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jake felt a mixture of excitement and terror about what he'd committed himself to accomplish. He'd entered the day as a desperate man clinging to a questionable partnership. He was ending it as an engaged man preparing to challenge dangerous enemy, alongside a remarkable woman who might become the best partner he'd ever hoped to find. The transformation felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air, trusting that wings would appear before he hit the ground. But as he looked at Emma's determined profile silhouetted against the sunset, Jake began to believe that some leaps of faith were worth the risk of falling. The wedding took place 3 days later in the modest parlor of Sheriff Tom Mitchell's home, with only the lawman and his wife Lucy serving as witnesses. Emma wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved despite years of hardship, while Jake had borrowed a proper suit from the general store owner. The ceremony itself was brief and practical, but something unexpected happened when they exchanged vows. Looking into Emma's eyes as he promised to honor and protect her, Jake felt a stirring of genuine emotion that surprised him with its intensity. Emma's voice was steady as she pledged her commitment, but her hand trembled slightly in his when they were pronounced husband and wife. The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle and respectful, yet it carried the weight of all the challenges they would face together. Sheriff Mitchell's congratulations were warm but cautious, reflecting his ongoing concerns about the dangerous situation the newlyweds were entering. Jake, Emma, I want you both to know that my office will provide whatever support we can, Mitchell said as they prepared to leave. But you're taking on powerful enemies who don't hesitate to use violence. Be careful, and don't try to handle everything alone. Emma squeezed Jake's arm gratefully. Sheriff, we appreciate everything you've done. Having the law on our side gives us hope that justice might actually prevail. The ride back to the Whitmore property felt different now that they were legally married. Despite the practical nature of their arrangement, something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer two individuals considering a business partnership. They were husband and wife preparing to defend their home and future together. Jake had spent the previous 2 days moving Emma's father to the main ranch house, which offered better security and more comfortable accommodations for an invalid. Samuel Whitmore remained largely unresponsive due to his stroke, but Emma insisted he showed signs of awareness when she spoke to him. Setting up a proper sick room had required considerable effort, but it also demonstrated their commitment to making the property a real home rather than just a business investment. The tax auction was scheduled for the following morning, and Jake had prepared their bid with meticulous care. Between his remaining savings and money borrowed against his own ranch, they could offer $400 for the Whitmore property, significantly more than the $300 required for back taxes. The higher bid was intended to discourage competition from other buyers, particularly Victor Blackwood. But when they arrived at the courthouse in Willow Springs for the auction, Jake's heart sank at what they found waiting. Blackwood stood near the auction platform, surrounded by 6 rough-looking men who were obviously hired gunfighters rather than legitimate ranch hands. The land speculator's message was clear. He intended to win this auction by intimidation if necessary, and he'd brought enforcement to back up his intentions. Morgan Hayes was also present, standing apart from Blackwood's group, but watching the proceedings with obvious interest. Jake noticed that Hayes had positioned himself near the exit, ready to leave quickly if the situation turned violent. The cattle buyer's presence confirmed Jake's suspicions about his true motives. Hayes was here to observe the outcome rather than participate in legitimate business. Emma moved closer to Jake as they approached the courthouse steps. That's quite a show of force Blackwood's brought, she observed quietly. He's not planning to rely on the highest bid to win this auction. Jake counted the armed men again and felt his stomach tighten with apprehension. Even with Sheriff Mitchell present to maintain order, 6 professional gunfighters could create chaos that would allow Blackwood to claim the property through intimidation rather than legal bidding. The land speculator had clearly decided that the Whitmore Ranch was worth more than the cost of hiring violent enforcement. Sheriff Mitchell emerged from the courthouse with the Territorial Land Commissioner, a nervous-looking bureaucrat named Philip Garrison, who obviously felt overwhelmed by the tension surrounding what should have been a routine tax sale. Garrison clutched his auction documents like a shield while scanning the assembled crowd for signs of potential trouble. "Gentlemen, ladies," Garrison announced in a voice that cracked slightly with stress, "we'll begin the auction for the Whitmore property in 5 minutes. All bids must be accompanied by immediate payment in cash or verified bank drafts." Blackwood stepped forward with theatrical confidence. "Commissioner Garrison, I trust this proceeding will be conducted according to proper legal standards. We wouldn't want any irregularities that might require later investigation." The veiled threat was clear to everyone present.
Blackwood was warning that he would challenge any outcome that didn't favor his interests, using his political connections and legal resources to overturn results he didn't like. For a territorial bureaucrat like Garrison, such threats represented potential career destruction. Jake felt anger rising in his chest at Blackwood's casual corruption of what should have been an impartial legal process. But before he could respond, Emma stepped forward with surprising composure. "Commissioner Garrison," she said clearly, "I'm Emma Thompson, and this property was my family's home for 15 years before financial difficulties forced its sale for taxes. I want to ensure that today's auction provides every qualified bidder with a fair opportunity to participate." Her intervention was brilliant political theater. By identifying herself as the original family and emphasizing fairness, Emma had positioned herself as the sympathetic party, while subtly suggesting that Blackwood represented outside interests trying to steal local property through manipulation. Several townspeople who'd gathered to watch the auction murmured approval of Emma's statement. Jake noticed that many residents of Willow Springs had come to observe the proceedings, drawn by rumors of confrontation between local families and outside speculators. Public opinion was clearly sympathetic to Emma's situation. Garrison seized on Emma's respectful approach as a way to maintain his authority despite Blackwood's intimidation. "Mrs. Thompson, I assure you that this auction will be conducted according to territorial law. All qualified bidders will have equal opportunity to participate." Blackwood's expression darkened at the bureaucrat's response, but he couldn't openly object to promises of legal fairness without revealing his own corrupt intentions. His hired gunfighters shifted restlessly, clearly prepared for violence but waiting for their employer's signal. The auction began with Garrison's announcement of the minimum bid required to cover back taxes and administrative costs. "The opening bid for the Whitmore property is $300. Do I hear 300? Jake raised his hand immediately. $300, Blackwood countered without hesitation. $350, 400, Jake responded, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his stomach. Blackwood's smile was predatory as he raised the stakes. $500. The jump was significant enough to draw gasps from the watching crowd. $500 was more than many families in Willow Springs earned in an entire year. And it suggested that Blackwood valued the property far beyond its apparent worth for simple ranching or farming. Jake felt sweat beading on his forehead as he calculated his remaining resources. He'd prepared for a bidding war, but not one that escalated this quickly, to amounts that threatened his ability to compete. Emma touched his arm gently, a reminder that they were partners facing this challenge together. $600, Jake said, his voice carrying across the courthouse square. Blackwood's confidence flickered for the first time as he realized Jake was prepared to fight seriously for the property. The land speculator had expected easy intimidation of a desperate rancher, but Jake's willingness to bid aggressively suggested resources and determination Blackwood hadn't anticipated. $700, Blackwood countered, but his voice carried less certainty than before. Jake felt his heart pounding as he approached the limits of what he could afford. Between his savings, his loan against his own ranch, and money Emma had contributed from selling her mother's jewelry, they had just enough to make one more significant bid. $800, Jake announced, putting everything they had into one final effort. The courtyard fell silent as everyone waited for Blackwood's response. The land speculator's face cycled through calculation, frustration, and growing anger as he realized the auction wasn't proceeding according to his plans. $800 was a substantial sum even for someone with Blackwood's resources, especially for property he'd expected to acquire for much less. $850, Blackwood said finally, his voice tight with controlled fury. Jake's heart sank as he realized they'd reached the end of their financial capacity. $800 had been their absolute maximum, scraped together through desperate measures and careful saving. Blackwood's additional $50 might as well have been $50,000 for all the chance Jake had of matching it. Emma leaned close to whisper in his ear, "Jake, we've done everything we could. Sometimes losing a battle allows you to win the war." Before Jake could ask what she meant, Sheriff Mitchell stepped forward with an unexpected announcement. Commissioner Garrison, before you award this property to Mr. Blackwood, there's a legal matter that needs to be addressed. Mitchell pulled a folded document from his vest pocket and handed it to the bewildered bureaucrat. This is a territorial warrant for Victor Blackwood's arrest on charges of attempted murder, conspiracy, and intimidation of witnesses. Mr. Blackwood, you're under arrest. The announcement hit the courtyard like a thunderclap. Blackwood's face went white, then red with rage, as he realized he'd been trapped in a public legal proceeding that eliminated his usual options for avoiding consequences. His hired gunfighters tensed, hands moving toward their weapons, but found themselves surrounded by armed townspeople who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "This is outrageous," Blackwood sputtered. "Sheriff Mitchell, you have no evidence to support such charges. This is clearly a conspiracy to interfere with legitimate business activities." Mitchell's smile was grim and satisfied. "Mr. Blackwood, we have plenty of evidence, including testimony from witnesses who saw your men shoot Samuel Whitmore, and documentation proving you've been using intimidation and violence to acquire properties throughout this territory." Jake looked around in amazement as he realized how carefully this moment had been orchestrated. Sheriff Mitchell hadn't been simply observing the auction, he'd been using it as a trap to capture Blackwood in a public setting where escape would be impossible. The townspeople weren't just curious spectators, they were armed citizens prepared to support law enforcement against a common enemy. Emma's hand found his as they watched Blackwood's carefully constructed empire begin to crumble. "Jake, I contacted Sheriff Mitchell yesterday and told him everything I knew about Blackwood's activities. It turns out several other families had been gathering evidence against him for months." The revelation explained Emma's mysterious confidence during the auction bidding. She'd known that Blackwood would be arrested before he could complete his purchase of the property, which meant their own bid would likely succeed regardless of the dollar amounts involved. Blackwood's gunfighters found themselves vastly outnumbered as armed citizens emerged from doorways and alleys throughout the courthouse square. The land speculators' hired muscle had been counting on intimidating a few isolated individuals, not confronting an entire community that had been preparing for this confrontation. "Drop your weapons," Sheriff Mitchell commanded. "Any man who draws iron in support of Blackwood will be charged as an accessory to his crimes." The hired gunfighters looked around desperately, realizing they'd walked into a trap that offered no reasonable chance of escape. One by one, they dropped their guns and stepped away from Blackwood, clearly unwilling to risk their lives for an employer who could no longer pay them. Commissioner Garrison watched these developments with obvious relief. "Sheriff Mitchell, in light of Mr. Blackwood's arrest, I believe we should postpone this auction until legal matters can be resolved." "No need for postponement," Mitchell replied. "Mr. Blackwood's bid is invalidated by his arrest on criminal charges. The highest remaining bid comes from Mr. and Mrs. Thompson for $800. Jake felt dizzy with relief and excitement as he realized they'd actually won the auction. The Whitmore property would belong to him and Emma, giving them the security and resources they needed to build a future together. More importantly, Blackwood's arrest eliminated the ongoing threat that had terrorized Emma's family for months. But their victory celebration was interrupted by an unexpected voice from the crowd. "Sheriff Mitchell, before you finalize this sale, there's another legal matter that requires attention." Morgan Hayes stepped forward, no longer maintaining his facade of legitimate cattle buyer. His expensive clothes and cultured manner remained the same, but his expression now showed the cold calculation of a predator whose prey had escaped through unexpected circumstances. "Mr. Hayes," Mitchell replied warily. "What legal matter?" Hayes produced an official-looking document from his jacket. "This is a territorial court order directing the seizure of all property owned by Mr. Thompson in connection with his participation in illegal gambling activities and fraudulent business practices." Jake felt the world spinning around him as he realized Hayes' true scheme was finally being revealed. The cattle buyer hadn't been planning to steal Jake's money or property directly. He'd been setting up a legal framework that would allow him to claim everything Jake owned through court orders and bureaucratic manipulation. "That document is fraudulent," Sheriff Mitchell declared after examining it briefly. The territorial court seal is forged and Judge Harrison is currently in Denver on official business. He couldn't have signed this order. Hayes's mask slipped completely, revealing the ruthless criminal beneath his polished exterior. Sheriff, you're interfering with legitimate legal proceedings. This court order supersedes any local authority you might claim. Mitchell drew his gun with practiced speed. Mr. Hayes, you're under arrest for forgery, fraud, and conspiracy. And I suspect when we investigate your background more thoroughly, we'll find enough additional charges to keep territorial courts busy for months. The revelation that both their major enemies were criminals provided Emma and Jake with a sense of vindication. But it also highlighted how close they'd come to losing everything to carefully planned schemes. If Sheriff Mitchell hadn't been investigating both men simultaneously, either Blackwood's violence or Hayes' fraud might have succeeded in destroying their hopes for a future together. As Hayes joined Blackwood in custody, Commissioner Garrison completed the auction with obvious relief that the proceedings could finally conclude according to normal legal standards. Jake signed the papers transferring ownership of the Whitmore property to him and Emma, officially making them partners in both marriage and business. The crowd that had gathered for the auction transformed into an impromptu celebration as word spread that both Blackwood and Hayes had been arrested. Many families had suffered under Blackwood's intimidation tactics, and others had heard warnings about confidence men operating throughout the territory. Seeing both threats eliminated in a single day felt like a community victory worth celebrating. Emma stood beside Jake as they watched their enemies being loaded into the sheriff's wagon for transport to the territorial prison. Jake, I need to tell you something important.
Honest people throughout the region. As the sun set over Willow Springs, Jake and Emma rode back to their property as legal owners and genuine partners. The ranch house that had been Samuel Whitmore's dream, then his daughter's burden, would now become the foundation for their shared future. Emma's father remained in the comfortable room they'd prepared for him, and while his recovery remained uncertain, he was safe and cared for in familiar surroundings. That evening, as they planned improvements and expansions for their combined ranch operation, Emma surprised Jake with another revelation about their rapidly developing relationship. Jake, I need you to know that this marriage started as a practical arrangement, but it's becoming something much more important to me. I'm developing feelings that go beyond business partnership or convenient collaboration. Jake set down the ranch records they'd been reviewing and moved closer to Emma. Are you saying you're falling in love with me? Emma's smile was shy but determined. I'm saying I've already fallen in love with you. The man who offered marriage to save a stranger, who stood up to dangerous enemies to protect his principles, who kept his vows even when the cost became higher than anyone could have anticipated. Jake pulled Emma into his arms, finally acknowledging emotions he'd been suppressing since their wedding day. Emma, I've been fighting the same feelings because I didn't want to complicate our arrangement. But I can't pretend anymore that this is just business. I love you, and I want our marriage to be real in every way. Their kiss was different from the polite peck that had sealed their wedding ceremony. This was passionate and genuine, expressing feelings that had grown from mutual respect into deep emotional connection. When they finally separated, both were breathing hard and looking at each other with new understanding. 6 months later, the Thompson Ranch had become one of the most successful cattle operations in Colorado Territory. Jake's organizational skills and Emma's ranching knowledge had proven to be an unbeatable combination, while their marriage had evolved into a love story that provided inspiration for other couples throughout the region. Samuel Whitmore had made remarkable progress in his recovery, regaining enough speech and mobility to participate in ranch management decisions and enjoy watching his daughter's happiness. The main ranch house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family comfortably, and they'd already started planning for children who would inherit both the property and the values that had made its preservation possible. Sheriff Mitchell visited regularly, bringing news about the trials of Blackwood and Hayes. Both men had been convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to lengthy prison terms that would keep them from threatening anyone else for decades. Their criminal networks had been dismantled, and several other confidence men and violent land speculators had been arrested using evidence discovered during the investigation. The story of Jake and Emma's courtship and marriage had spread throughout the territory, often told as an example of how love could grow from the most practical beginnings when two people shared common values and mutual respect. Their willingness to stand up to powerful enemies had made them local heroes, while their successful ranch operation had made them prosperous members of their community. On a warm spring evening, as they sat on their porch watching cattle graze in fields that now legally belonged to them, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of contentment and security. "Jake, do you remember when I begged you not to leave me to die? I was asking you to save more than just my life. I was asking you to save my hope, my future, and my ability to believe that good things were still possible." Jake took her hand, noting the wedding ring that now symbolized genuine love rather than mere convenience. "Emma, you saved me just as much as I saved you. I was drifting without purpose, focused on survival instead of building something meaningful. You gave me a reason to fight for principles instead of just fighting to stay alive." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. A family of settlers was riding up their valley trail, looking tired and desperate in the way that had become familiar throughout the territory. Economic hardships, failed crops, and various misfortunes were constantly displacing families who needed assistance to rebuild their lives. Emma squeezed Jake's hand as they prepared to greet their unexpected visitors. "Jake, I think we have another opportunity to help people who need what we once needed ourselves." Jake smiled, understanding exactly what Emma meant. Their own experience of desperation and rescue had taught them the importance of extending help to others facing similar challenges. The Thompson Ranch was prosperous enough now to provide employment, temporary shelter, and guidance to families struggling to establish themselves in the territory. As they walked toward their visitors, ready to offer whatever assistance was needed, Jake reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that desperate night at the poker table. He'd entered that game as a failing rancher with nothing to lose, and he'd emerged as a married man with everything to gain. The vow he'd made to Emma had indeed changed everything, transforming both their lives and creating ripples of positive change that extended far beyond their own relationship. The sun set behind them as they welcomed the settler family with the same generosity and hope that had once been extended to them in their own moment of greatest need. Some promises Jake had learned had the power to transform not just individual lives but entire communities, creating legacies of love and mutual support that would endure for generations to come. 2 years had passed since that fateful autumn when Jake Thompson's desperate gamble at a poker table had led him to the love of his life and the fight of his lifetime. The Thompson Ranch now sprawled across nearly 1,500 acres of prime Colorado Territory grazing land, supporting over 300 head of cattle and employing 8 full-time ranch hands. What had started as a marriage of convenience between two desperate people had blossomed into a partnership that had transformed not only their own lives but the entire character of Willow Springs and the surrounding valley. Emma Thompson stood on the wraparound porch of their expanded ranch house, watching her husband direct the construction of a new barn that would shelter their growing herd through the coming winter. Her hand rested protectively over the gentle swell of her belly, where their first child grew strong and healthy. At 6 months pregnant, Emma still insisted on participating in ranch management decisions, though Jake had finally convinced her to leave the more physically demanding work to their hired hands. The changes in Emma since their marriage were remarkable to witness. The desperate young woman who had once begged not to be left to die had transformed into a confident ranch owner who commanded respect throughout the territory. Her business acumen had proven invaluable in expanding their operation, while her medical knowledge had made their ranch a refuge for families facing health crises. Emma had quietly established a reputation as the most skilled healer between Denver and Colorado Springs, treating everything from difficult childbirths to mining accidents with remarkable success. Samuel Whitmore sat in his wheelchair beside Emma, his recovery from the stroke more complete than any doctor had dared predict. Though his speech remained slightly slurred and his left arm showed limited mobility, his mind was sharp as ever, and he took enormous pride in watching his daughter's accomplishments. Samuel had become Jake's closest advisor on ranch management, his decades of experience proving invaluable as they navigated the challenges of rapid expansion. "Emma dear," Samuel said, his voice carrying the slight thickness that remained from his injury. "Jake's going to wear himself out if he keeps pushing that hard. The man acts like he's still fighting for survival instead of managing a successful operation." Emma smiled at her father's observation. Jake did indeed throw himself into every project with the intensity of someone who'd nearly lost everything and remained determined never to face such vulnerability again. But she also recognized that his relentless work ethic stemmed from deeper motivations than mere financial security. Papa, Jake's not just building a ranch, Emma replied, watching her husband gesture emphatically as he explained construction details to their lead carpenter. He's building a legacy that will provide security for our children and stability for everyone who depends on us for employment. He takes that responsibility seriously. The responsibility was indeed substantial. The Thompson Ranch had become the largest employer in the Willow Springs area, providing steady work for men who might otherwise drift from job to job throughout the territory. Jake insisted on paying fair wages and providing safe working conditions, standards that had attracted skilled workers and established their operation as a model for ethical business practices. Their success had also created opportunities to help other struggling families establish themselves in the territory. Over the past 2 years, Jake and Emma had provided temporary employment, loans for land purchases, and guidance for dozens of settlers seeking to build new lives in Colorado. Their willingness to extend assistance had created a network of loyal friends and business associates that strengthened their position throughout the region. But success had also brought new challenges and responsibilities that sometimes tested even their strong partnership. As their wealth and influence grew, so did the expectations placed upon them by their community. Emma found herself organizing charity drives for families affected by mining accidents, while Jake was increasingly called upon to mediate disputes between ranchers and settle questions about water rights and grazing boundaries. The territorial government had recently approached Jake about accepting appointment as a territorial representative, a position that would require spending months each year in Denver working on legislation affecting rural communities. The opportunity represented significant honor and potential political influence, but it would also demand time away from the ranch and family that Jake was reluctant to sacrifice. Emma, Jake called from the construction site, "Could you come look at these barn plans? I want to make sure we're including everything you think we'll need for the medical supplies storage." Emma kissed her father's forehead and walked carefully down the porch steps, mindful of her changing balance as her pregnancy progressed. Jake's consideration for her medical practice in every ranch improvement decision was typical of the thoughtfulness that had made their marriage so successful. He never dismissed her professional interests as secondary to ranch operations. Instead, he looked for ways to integrate her healing work into their overall business strategy. The barn plans spread across a makeshift table showed impressive attention to detail. Jake had designed not only space for livestock and feed storage, but also a dedicated area where Emma could prepare medicines and treat patients who required overnight observation. The design included proper ventilation, easy access to clean water, and enough space to handle multiple patients during emergencies. "Jake, this is perfect," Emma said, studying the carefully drawn specifications. "You've thought of everything I mentioned and several things I hadn't considered. This will be better equipped than most doctors' offices in larger towns." Jake's satisfied smile revealed how much her approval meant to him. Even after 2 years of marriage, he still sought her opinion on every significant decision, treating her as a true partner rather than simply a wife who should be consulted out of politeness. Their relationship had evolved into the kind of genuine partnership that many couples never achieved despite decades of marriage. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you," Jake said, lowering his voice so their conversation wouldn't be overheard by the construction workers. "I received another letter from the territorial government about the representative position. They're pressing for an answer and the appointment would begin in 6 months." Emma felt her stomach tighten with conflicting emotions. The political appointment represented tremendous recognition of Jake's accomplishments and could provide opportunities to influence legislation that affected ranching families throughout Colorado Territory. But it would also mean long separations during their first child's early years, and the timing seemed particularly challenging. "What does your heart tell you about it?" Emma asked, the question she'd learned to pose whenever they faced difficult decisions. Jake gazed across their valley, taking in the thriving ranch operation they'd built together and the community of families who depended on their continued success. "My heart tells me that I have responsibilities here that matter more than political recognition. But my mind says that representing territorial interests could help protect everything we've built." The tension between personal desires and public duty was a challenge many successful people faced, but it carried particular weight for someone like Jake, who'd risen from near destitution to regional prominence. His decisions affected not only his own family but dozens of employees and their families, as well as the broader community that had come to rely on his leadership. Emma took his hand, noting the calluses that remained despite their prosperity, evidence of his continued hands-on approach to ranch management. Jake, remember what you told me when we first discussed marriage? You said you expected shared decision-making about matters that affect both our interests. This is exactly that kind of decision. They spent the afternoon walking their property and discussing the implications of accepting or declining the political appointment. The territory's offer was indeed an honor, but it came at a time when their personal and business lives were entering a new phase that demanded their full attention. Emma's pregnancy, Samuel's ongoing recovery, and the ranch's rapid expansion all required leadership that couldn't be provided from a political office in Denver. As they walked, they encountered various employees and their families, people whose livelihoods depended on the continued success of the Thompson Ranch. Maria Santos, whose husband Miguel managed their horse breeding program, was hanging laundry outside the small house they'd provided for workers with families. Her 3 children played nearby, healthy and well-fed because their father had steady employment at fair wages. Mrs. Thompson, Maria called out, "How are you feeling? Is the baby moving much today?" Emma smiled at the genuine concern in Maria's voice. Over the past 2 years, their employees had become extended family, sharing in both celebrations and challenges. Maria's question reflected the community spirit that had developed around their ranch operation. "Very active today," Emma replied, placing her hand over her belly. "I think this child is going to be as energetic as his father." The casual conversation highlighted one of the most important aspects of what Jake and Emma had built together. They'd created not just a successful business, but a genuine community where people cared about each other's welfare and shared in each other's successes. Political office might provide broader influence, but it would require abandoning the personal relationships that gave their success meaning. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant colors, Jake made his decision about the territorial appointment. "Emma, I'm going to decline the representative position. Whatever influence I might gain in Denver can't match the good we're doing right here." Emma leaned against his shoulder, feeling relief wash over her at his choice. "Are you certain? This might be your only opportunity for political office." Jake's arm tightened around her as he felt their baby move within her. "I'm certain. We're building something here that matters more than political recognition. Our child should grow up knowing that his parents chose family and community over personal ambition." The decision felt right the moment Jake spoke it aloud, confirming what his heart had been telling him throughout weeks of consideration. Political office might bring recognition and influence, but it would require sacrificing the daily hands-on leadership that made their ranch operation so successful and personally fulfilling. 3 months later, Emma went into labor during one of the worst snowstorms in territorial memory. Dr. Williams had been snowed in at a distant ranch, leaving Emma to rely on her own medical knowledge and Jake's steady support during the most challenging and important experience of their lives. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that Emma, who had spent 2 years helping other women through difficult childbirths, would face her own delivery without professional assistance. Jake had assisted at enough animal births to understand the basic process, but human childbirth carried emotional weight that made every moment feel fraught with significance. As Emma's labor intensified throughout the night, he found himself praying with desperate intensity to whatever powers might be listening, promising anything in exchange for the safe delivery of their child and Emma's continued health. "Jake," Emma gasped during a brief respite between contractions, "if something happens to me, promise you'll tell our child how much this pregnancy meant to us. How excited we were to become parents together." The request terrified Jake more than any physical danger he'd ever faced. "Nothing's going to happen to you," he said firmly. "You're the strongest person I know, and you've delivered dozens of babies. You know exactly what to do."
Emma's grip on his hand tightened as another contraction began. I know the medical procedures, but this feels completely different when it's your own body. I need you to be strong for both of us right now. Jake drew upon reserves of courage he hadn't known he possessed, providing Emma with the steady support and encouragement she needed to navigate the most physically demanding experience of her life. Between contractions, he helped her change positions, brought water and clean cloths, and maintained the calm confidence that allowed her to focus on the work her body was doing. As dawn broke over the snow-covered valley, their son entered the world with a cry that announced his healthy arrival to anyone within hearing distance. Jake found himself weeping with relief and joy as he held his newborn child for the first time. Overwhelmed by the magnitude of love and responsibility that came with fatherhood. Emma, exhausted but radiant with happiness, reached for the baby with tears streaming down her face. Jake, look what we made together. He's perfect. The tiny boy was indeed perfect, with Emma's green eyes and Jake's determined chin, already showing the strong will that would serve him well in territorial life. As Emma nursed their son for the first time, Jake felt his priorities crystallizing with absolute clarity. This moment, this family, this life they'd built together, represented everything that truly mattered. They named their son Thomas Samuel Thompson, honoring both Jake's father and Emma's, linking their child to the legacy of both families while establishing his own identity. Samuel Whitmore wept openly when they told him of the honor, his pride in his daughter's happiness and his grandson's arrival evident despite his limited speech. The months following Thomas's birth brought new challenges and deeper satisfaction than either Jake or Emma had anticipated. Parenthood demanded adjustments to their work routines and decision-making processes, but it also strengthened their partnership in unexpected ways. Watching Jake with their son revealed depths of tenderness and patience that complemented his strength and determination. Emma discovered that motherhood enhanced rather than diminished her other roles as ranch partner and community healer. Her experience with childbirth and infant care made her even more valuable to other families facing similar challenges, while her fierce protectiveness of Thomas motivated her to work harder for the security and prosperity of their entire community. 1 year after Thomas's birth, Jake and Emma received news that transformed their understanding of how far their influence had spread throughout the territory. The Colorado Territorial Legislature had passed new regulations governing land speculation and property acquisition, laws specifically designed to prevent the kind of abuse they'd suffered from Victor Blackwood. Their willingness to stand up to corruption had inspired legislative changes that would protect other families from similar exploitation. Sheriff Tom Mitchell brought them the news during one of his regular visits, his satisfaction obvious as he described the impact their case had created. Jake, Emma, you should know that your fight against Blackwood and Hayes has changed how business is conducted throughout this territory. The new laws require public notice of all property sales, prohibit intimidation tactics, and create penalties for fraudulent land deals. The knowledge that their personal struggle had contributed to broader justice provided deep satisfaction that went beyond their individual success. They'd faced their challenges not just for themselves but for everyone who might face similar threats in the future. Their courage had created a legacy of protection for other families. As they reflected on the journey that had brought them from desperation to prosperity, from a marriage of convenience to deep love, from individual survival to community leadership, Jake and Emma understood that their story was still being written. Thomas toddled around their ranch house with the confidence of a child who'd never known want or fear, but he would grow up in a world shaped by his parents' determination to fight for justice and build something lasting. The evening sun cast long shadows across their valley as Jake and Emma sat on their porch, watching their son play while Samuel dozed in his wheelchair nearby. 3 generations of their family were represented in that peaceful scene, linked by love and shared commitment to the values that had sustained them through their darkest moments. Emma, Jake said quietly, do you remember that first day when you begged me not to leave you to die? Did you imagine it would lead to all this? Emma shifted Thomas to her other knee and smiled at her husband with the kind of deep contentment that comes from a life well lived. Jake, I was begging you to save more than my life that day. I was asking you to save my hope, my future, everything I thought I'd lost forever. You didn't just keep me from dying, you helped me learn how to truly live. The wind rustled through the cottonwood trees that had witnessed their first tentative conversations about marriage and partnership. Those same trees now shaded a thriving ranch operation, a loving family, and a community that had grown stronger through their example of courage and commitment. Jake pulled Emma closer, marveling at how a moment of desperate gambling had led to the greatest prize he could have imagined. Emma, that vow I made to you changed everything for both of us. But I think the real transformation came from learning to trust each other completely. To face every challenge as partners instead of trying to survive alone. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, another family seeking assistance or opportunity at the ranch that had become known throughout the territory for its generosity and fair dealing. Jake and Emma exchanged glances, silently communicating their readiness to help however they could. As they prepared to welcome their unexpected visitors, Emma reflected on the cycle of assistance and support that had become central to their lives. They'd been helped in their moment of greatest need, and now they provided that same help to others facing similar challenges. The kindness they'd received had multiplied through their willingness to extend it to others, creating ripples of positive change that spread far beyond their own family. The approaching riders proved to be a young couple with two small children, their belongings loaded on a single pack horse in the way that suggested people who'd lost everything and were starting over with nothing but hope and determination. Jake recognized the look in their eyes, the same desperation he'd felt that night at the poker table when everything depended on cards and luck. "Good evening," Jake called out as they approached. "You folks look like you could use a hot meal and a safe place to rest for the night." The young man's relief was visible as he helped his wife down from her horse. "Mister, we'd be grateful for any kindness you could spare. We've been traveling for weeks, looking for work and a place to settle." Emma stood carefully, holding Thomas against her shoulder. "There's always room for families who need help. Let's get you settled and fed, and tomorrow we can discuss what opportunities might be available." As they welcomed the struggling family into their home, Jake felt the deep satisfaction that came from being able to provide hope to people who'd nearly given up. The cycle of kindness that had saved his own life continued through their willingness to extend similar assistance to others facing desperate circumstances. Later that evening, after their guests had been fed and settled in the bunkhouse with their children, Jake and Emma sat before their fireplace discussing how they might help the new arrivals establish themselves in the territory. The conversation was typical of hundreds they'd shared over the past 3 years, planning how to use their resources and influence to create opportunities for other families. The Hendersons mentioned they need reliable help with their expanding dairy operation. Emma said, nursing Thomas while they planned. "And we could certainly use another hand with the horse training program. This family might be exactly what both operations need." Jake nodded, already mentally calculating wages and housing arrangements that would allow the newcomers to establish financial independence while contributing to the community's prosperity. Their own success had taught them that the best business relationships were built on mutual benefit and shared commitment to long-term growth. "Emma, sometimes I think about that poker game and realize it wasn't really gambling at all. Everything that followed was the result of choices we made together, risks we were willing to take for each other, and for principles we believed in." Emma looked up from Thomas, her eyes bright with the love and respect that had grown stronger with each challenge they'd faced together. "Jake, the real gamble was trusting each other enough to build something together. Everything else was just the work of making that trust worth the risk." The fire crackled softly as they sat in comfortable silence, 3 generations of their family safe and secure in the home they'd built through courage, determination, and unwavering commitment to each other. Outside, snow began to fall gently over their valley, covering the landscape in pristine white that promised renewal and continued growth in the spring to come. Thomas dozed peacefully in his mother's arms, unaware that his very existence represented the fulfillment of dreams his parents had barely dared to hope for during their darkest moments. He would grow up knowing the security and love that had eluded both Jake and Emma during their own childhoods, and he would learn the values of courage, compassion, and community service that had transformed his parents' lives. As the evening deepened and the storm intensified outside, Jake reflected on the vow he'd made to Emma that had indeed changed everything. What had started as a desperate attempt to solve immediate problems had evolved into a partnership that had transformed not only their own lives but the entire character of their community. The promise to stand by each other had created ripples of positive change that would continue for generations to come. The wind howled around their sturdy ranch house, but inside, the Thompson family was warm, secure, and complete.